Good evening and welcome to the post-budget analysis for Budget 2018. I'm Terence Das. Thank you for joining me in the program. And we're looking forward to dissecting the 2018 budget recently tabled by the Honorable Prime Minister. It's touted by many as an inclusive budget, a budget that takes into account just about everybody. And from the abolishment of tolls in Selangor to, of course, the expansion of the Penang airport, I know everybody, including people on the other side of the bench, are smiling because they know that it's something for everybody. Now, we're not going to focus on too many broad strokes in this program. We're going to go into points that we think are valuable and are important, and that will enable us to spend more time on these points without spending too much time talking about the budget in general. I know many of the programmings on RTM will be doing just that in the week to come. But first, let's get into some of those broad strokes. We're going to take you through a snapshot of the budget, beginning with the fiscal deficit. True to his promise, the Honorable Prime Minister and Finance Minister has kept the budget deficit on a descending curve. As we see in 2017, the deficit was at 3%, and for 2018, it's at 2.8%. Rating agencies are bound to be happy at this achievement. Up next, we're going to take you through the entirety of the fiscal spending for the budget. Here we go. It's an expansionary budget, and it's a total of 280.25 billion allocation for the 2018 budget, 234.25 billion being for operations, and 46 billion being for developmental expenditure. Let's move on. Now, the next set of figures that we're going to show you is GDP. Now, projection for 2017 is from 5.2 to 5.7%. Despite some headway in the early part of the year, we seem to have recovered and are on an upward curve. In 2018, the projection is from 5 to 5.5%, still better than the national average for most countries around the world, including developed nations. Let's get into some of those salient points that we're talking about. Now, our producers chose to focus on the sixth thrust of the budget, which is on fortifying the fourth industrial revolution and the digital economy. How do we do that? Well, here's what the Prime Minister and Finance Minister has outlined. Matching grants under the Domestic Investment Strategic Fund to enhance smart manufacturing facilities, 245 million ringgit is going to be spent on this. Smart manufacturing facilities enable these manufacturing factories to actually operate 24/7 using big data analytics, coupling that with traditional manufacturing practices to give the best product possible in the fastest possible time. There'll also be a sandbox of sorts to help groom the next big thing, the next big scientific discovery, the next big service structure. It's strengthening the Futurized Center in Cyberjaya, being a one-stop center now for corporates and universities to develop prototype products and services. Now, tax incentives are a big part of any budget. So for this budget, the tax incentives that we're going to focus on for this part of the program is focused on Industry 4.0. There's an extension of the incentive period for accelerated capital allowance on automation equipment from 2018 to 2020, and an accelerated capital allowance incentive of up to 200% for manufacturing and manufacturing-related services sectors. Also, capital allowance incentives for ICT equipment beginning 2018 to 2020. So we see the period that stretches into 2020, enabling us to achieve that developed nation status with the Industry 4.0 revolution intact. This means that more and more factories around Malaysia will be focused on this Industry 4.0 gear up, and as the rollout has been in phases in Malaysia, it is going to be gaining traction with this budget. Green technology, a big buzzword still in the budget today. And as we look at green tech financing schemes to promote investment in green technology, 5 billion ringgit will be allocated just for this. Water is key and crucial in just about every sector and every strata of society. Non-revenue water programs to reduce the loss of water is something so important. A program that will cost the government 1.4 billion ringgit will be put in place. Also, the construction of off-river storage as an alternative water resource, 1.3 billion ringgit will be focused in this effort. Floods still hit Malaysia, flash floods in the cities and also in the East Coast. 517 million ringgit will be spent on flood mitigation efforts. And the big rollout for the digital free trade zone. The announcement was made in March. And of course, there's going to be a big launch on the 3rd of November. The digital free trade zone will be taking center stage in 2018. And the first rollout, the DFTZ Aeropolis in KLIA, will cost 83.5 million ringgit. So, in the early get-going to the program, I'm sure you can see that this is the gear up to take us into the future. Not only with Industry 4.0, but also with the digital free trade zone, we're hoping to really encompass a new set of economic skill sets among young Malaysians. And the TN50 aspiration is something that takes into account every opinion from every level of society. More and more, we see young people asking for grants that help them build capacity within their very tech-savvy enterprises. And I believe this budget has done just that. Now, there are other breakdowns of the budget. We're going to go into some of the points that may be a bit contentious, so don't go anywhere. Stay right where you are. We're going to break down the budget and also bring you some opinions from across Malaysia about what they think Budget 2018 means for them. Don't go anywhere.
Overall, I think we're very happy because of the increase of the overall budget, almost 20 million. I come from the higher education sector, and we are definitely happy, especially with the introduction of the doubling up of the research fund from 200 million almost to 400 million. And the scholarship for my brain that would encourage the postgraduate students, and this would definitely boost up the performance of the public universities in particular. And I think what the Prime Minister also mentioned in his speech, the performance of our higher education institutions, especially the research universities, has been tremendous, at the top 1% of the world.
And I like it most is the one that the individual tax that reduced by 2%. Yes. And also the, what you call that, for the elderly and the handicapped people, they have give extra, I think the monthly welfare, the one that have increased, which is also is very helpful. So in general, I think on the part, I'm pretty happy.
Reducing tax from 5% to 3% will help Malaysian people. Like, let's say for people who getting income below 2,000, they'll be happy for this.
What I can think about the PTPTN right now is they have a good plan, but then the urgency of we paying back, it's kind of like, burdening the students right now. So because yes, they have the plan, but then if can, I would rather personally suggest when the students who've been employed, because they have the employment EPF, correct? So if they can check with that, maybe they can deduct from EPF or monthly basis manner, it will be much more easier for us. Yes, it's the plans that they come up with the budget, whereby monthly basis, whereby by debit transferring, it is easier for students.
It can greatly cut down our costs during our travel, and then can help reduce our cost of living also.
It allows people to return the money without lesser burden. So I think it's quite nice.
A lot of smiles there from our fellow Malaysians. Let me correct one of them, though. If you're earning below 2,000, you never needed to pay any tax to begin with. So let's start with that, and then we'll move on into focusing into tax matters and also other interesting points brought up by this budget and addressed in a very inclusive manner. That's, of course, the public opinion. Let's find out what our guests think. We have Dr. KHALID, founder and chief economist of DMAnalytics, and also boutique social economic research and consultancy. Thank you very much for being here. Welcome to the program, Doctor. We also have THERESA Goh, MICPA council member and executive director and transfer pricing leader at Deloitte Malaysia. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, let's get started with you, Doctor. How inclusive do you think this budget is?
It depends who you ask. If you split it by age, for instance, almost everyone will get something.
Right.
If you're old, you get something. If you're young, you get something. If you're a woman, you get something.
If you're just going to be born next year, you still get
something.
Yeah,
correct. Born by January. If you're in public sector, you get something. In private, less. If you B40, you get something. M40 something. Top 20, not much. But does it mean it's inclusive? Does it mean this towards inclusive growth, inclusive society, which we espouse in 11 Malaysian Plan? It's not. Unfortunately, it's not. We have this program before to help the B40 to make inclusive. We give assistance to those in the agriculture sector. We give BRIM. But the level of inequality in Malaysia, taken from government number, between 2014 and 2016, the gap between the rich and poor has not changed. It's not inclusive. That's number one. Then you ask, what is the definition of inclusive? Everyone should benefit, especially the poor, and equitable distribution of wealth. So the gap between rich and poor is not narrowed. Number two, which makes it not inclusive, is this. The share of the economic growth, income that goes to the poor has not gone up. In fact, it has gone down. The share of the income that goes to the poor, bottom 40, from 16.8% to 16.4%. And we have target to increase to 20% by 2020. We are not reaching there.
Well, so the Prime Minister did present some figures to the contrary. He said the gap has reduced, really, between the rich and the poor to 0.39. That was the figure he presented. So when we look at different calculation methods, perhaps we can arrive at different conclusions.
No, I'm using the same number.
The same number.
The number is 0.401 to 0.399. You run it out, it's the same.
Okay. That's a very good point there, Doctor. But let's see if these tax measures can help reduce that gap. Theresa, previously, if someone was earning 3,100 ringgit a month, he would not need to pay any tax. He would need to start paying tax. But now that figure has been revised, so only if someone earns somewhere around 3,500 ringgit would he now need to come into the ambit of paying income tax. That does give a person an allowance of up to 300 to 400 ringgit a month. Money he's going to consume with, money he's going to put back into the economy. And that's just the individual. There are also revisions on households. And this has helped the M40. Do you think some of these tax measures will help address that gap between the rich and the poor the doctor opened with?
Well, if you look at the amount of disposable income that the reduction in tax rates give, then if you look at the chargeable income, when we talk about chargeable income, we're talking about your total salary, net of all your personal reliefs and all that you can claim, and then the taxable income, right? So taxable income of 20 to 35,000, the savings is only 300. 35 to 50,000 a year, that's the savings is only 600. And 50,000 onwards, that's 1,000. And that's where it's right in the sense that the 1,000, everybody benefits from that 1,000 savings as well. But if you look at it, I mean, on a big picture basis, should we be taxing the M40 that much? So if you look at the scale, the tax scale, after the 50,000, then you're already paying tax at a very much high rate, you see. 70,000 of income, you're still paying tax at 14%, all right? The scale rates are up to 14%. But from 70 to 100, then you suddenly see a big jump. From 14%, it goes up to 21%, right? And then 100 to 250, the next 100 to 250, it's at 24%.
And that's the max.
Yeah, so the question for us is, would you say someone earning, with, this is net chargeable income of 70,000 or 100,000, maybe you gross it up with all the reliefs and everything, 120,000 a year, for example, which is like 10,000 a month, would you consider that to be middle income or not, And should they be paying taxes at 24%? So probably more can be done, at that level as well, if you talk about helping the middle income.
But 10,000 would be paying 21%, right?
10,000, yes, at the
21%.
21%, 70 to 100,000.
200 and above bracket just yet. But based on the current figures that we have, that is the middle income group. That is the M40. And they have been, of course, saying that there's not enough housing for them. They can only afford X amount of housing because they do have an elevated status of living as well. They have cars, they have the need to buy new gadgets, etc., etc. So the M40 group, slightly different from the B40 group. But when we look at the B40 group, what does this budget do, Doctor, to specifically address the concerns of the B40? Do you think it does enough to help the B40 community find some ladder to climb out of that B40 status?
Okay. There are good measures introduced to help B40. But you need to know who are the B40. Big chunk, the elderly, or about to retire. That one, for instance, BRIM assistance is good. But for me, I would reform BRIM.
Yeah. I think we all agree on that.
Yeah.
Number one. Number two, to the poor. You give to the poor. You increase, in fact, to Bantu Orang Tua, 300 to 350. But would this help them? I would say it's not enough because you're only addressing on the income side. You're not really addressing the expenditure side. Like the guy just now who mentioned, below 2,000, I don't pay tax. In fact, he's partially correct. He pays GST. And if you're low income, you spend more on food, more on consumption than on savings. Yeah. And in fact, in a percentage of their income, they pay more. In a way, GST is regressive. So there's, to help them both equation on the income side and expenditure, we can do more. By giving income, but you're not addressing the source. Why it's not enough, it's not going to help. Expenditure side also must be addressed.
We looked at how the budget did revise certain aspects of the taxation scheme here in Malaysia. But would it have done a little better if it could have revised the method of dispersal of BRIM? We talked about this on radio as well, of how BRIM could be given in a more capacity-building format where there was a trade-off, something that the community had to use the BRIM for, a specific target as to where they would put that money to use. Theresa, what do you think?
I'm kind of saddened by the fact that, you know, each budget we are looking at, you know, B40, and we're just giving them handouts like that, right? It's definitely not enough, and we can't continue doing this, right? And it doesn't really help. What was supposed to be a lot of money, 1,200, you know, a year, but if you really look at cost of things nowadays, I think it's still a challenge, right? So, so we talk about how do you get them out of poverty, right? How do you get them out of that? Well, it's got to be education, right? It's been education. Education has helped many of us, right? Get out from there before, right? We were doing much better than our generations before. But then the question is, are we really doing enough? Have we really, you know, taken all the tough measures that are necessary for us to do that? And that's the B40 level. And education at the M40 level, again, the same problems that we see, right? It's just, well, at best, 1 degree, right? But how many, what percentage of our people actually go for masters and then PhD, right? So if you talk about a high income nation, how do we get our people, you know, up there? So are we providing, we're happy with all the scholarships and everything, the amount set aside, etc. But really, what percentage of the people who need it are actually, you know, able to get it? I mean, that's the question, I guess.
Doctor, on that point of education, before you answer, we looked at all the good news for fortifying Industry 4.0. But in order to embrace Industry 4.0, there has to be a certain amount of retraining, reskilling, and giving those involved in Industry 4.0, the blue-collar workers, some amount of retraining, because they need to know more than just manufacturing. They need to know a little bit about data analytics. They need to know a little bit about handling the cloud, big data. These are things that are not taught to them in their current scope. So when Theresa mentioned education, a point that rolled into my mind is, are we able to retrain, refit these workers with new skills to embrace the new digital and also industrial revolutions, Doctor?
Before I answer that, I want to comment a bit on the last question on BRIM, as a tool to reform on taxation and BRIM. BRIM, the biggest drawback of BRIM is this. It does not differentiate between a household size. A family of 1 or a family of 2, 10, same amount.
Absolutely.
Number 1. Number 2, those in Gua Musang and those in Bangsa, let's say if somebody in Bangsa happens to get it, it's the same. It's not addressing cost of living. 2 drawbacks. And BRIM as a tool on fiscal tools to address inequality is not effective. Because tax system, we want to reform tax system, it's not just looking at income tax. All sources of earnings in Malaysia must be treated equally. Now, if you wage earner, M40, you pay tax. But if you top 20, for instance, or you don't have income from wages, from capital, what's the tax that you pay? 0.
No inheritance tax.
No inheritance, no capital gain tax.
No capital gain tax.
Estate duty, 0. Other countries have this. to make sure country is becoming more equal, it's not through brain. It's more through addressing fiscal policy, tax policy to make it more fair. It's not to penalize the rich, to make sure it's fair. Number one, on education, access. Now access to the poor is becoming less. Because our society now, we decide what's best for me. I get good grades, I get access. You don't get good grades, doesn't matter because you cannot have good meals, school is far, no quality. I don't really care.
But is that a bit unfair? I mean, don't we provide for the needy? Don't we have schemes and scholarships targeted to individuals whose household earnings are at a certain level?
Agree. But the criteria number one, you take boarding school. How you apply? You apply online. Again, if you're from Gua Musang, no disrespect to Gua Musang, how are you going to apply online? Number one. Criteria number two, all A's. You manage to get all A's, then consideration is given to family socio-economic background. How are you going to get all A's if it's going to be difficult, right? Food, quality, access to school, quality of education in rural areas, we're penalizing the poor. Well, unless you address this, then we can move towards inclusive society, which we were before.
Well, it looks like we've got a lot of points to discuss on that. But Theresa, I suppose the question on education for Industry 4.0, I have to now redirect to you. Are we doing enough to reskill and retrain our blue-collar workers, to refit them for this new industry?
Yeah, we definitely, I don't think we've really thought about that yet, right? And if you talk about the incentives that the government has mentioned, hopefully it's going to be in there because they talk about grants, they talk about accelerated capital allowance, but you don't have all the other details
on capital,
yet, right?
So it's focused on machinery.
Correct. What about people, right? So there's no mention about maybe double deduction for training or retraining of these people, etc., right? And probably you've got to start maybe a few steps earlier, and that is even during university and everything, you've got to direct them in terms of their career, maybe into logistics and into all these new areas to support the digital free trade zones that are coming up, right? But to digress a little bit, I really don't agree with some of the things that were mentioned earlier, especially on inheritance tax, right? And if you talk about the top 20, right? So if you look at the top 20, of course, personal tax rate is already at 28%, whereas corporate tax rate is only at 24%, right? So employees, not business owners, but employees at that level are already paying tax at 28%, right? If you talk about inheritance tax, there is real property gains tax. We don't have capital gains tax, but we do have RPGT, right?
5 years,
yeah, 5 years for individuals, right? Other than that, any rental income from properties, etc., that's taxable as well.
That's taxable.
Right? And if it's owned by the individual, then you go up to the 28% tax rate as well, right? So it's not, and many countries, even Australia and all that, have done away with inheritance taxes. Right? So it doesn't really, it's not equitable to the rich, right? So you find some other ways to tax them, but I think it's not so much of going after the top 20% and taxing them some more. I mean, that's something that you can do, but for employees, then you got to worry about brain drain and all that as well, right? Not frightening them off. But other than that, I mean, if you talk about the total working population of 14 million, only 2.2 million are paying taxes. What's going on, right?
Personal income tax,
EPF says,
but in terms of taxes, they do pay tax.
Everybody
pay tax.
But where EPF is concerned, well, only 50% of the workforce are contributing to EPF. So what it leads to, or what it implies, seems to be that there is that, that shadow economy. Yeah, and that's got a huge chunk of the shadow economy that's not brought into tax, right? So a lot of enforcement, customs, IRB and all that, nowadays they're going for joint audits together, customs and IRB together, right? So they're doing a lot under the CIA, right? They combine information, resources and everything, especially information, etc. But if you talk about the shadow economy, they don't register any tax file for income tax purposes, whether individual tax or corporate tax. If they don't have a company, they're not with CCM, Companies Commission of Malaysia, so that CIA will probably not have their data, and
This is slowly turning into a bash the top 20 forum. Because another thing about the top 20 is they're highly mobile. They're able to move their assets, they're able to move their income, they're able to register in different countries where the tax code benefits them.
But this is not top 20, we're talking about top 0.1. Top 20, if you earn more than 10,000, you're top 20. Right? If there's two income earners, there's 5,000 ringgit a month. It's not top 20. It's not the rich.
All right, things are getting really hot right here, but before we continue with the conversation, we're going to take a little chill pill and cool off for just a moment. So we're going to come back and continue to dissect the budget for 2018. Don't go anywhere. Stay right where you are. We'll be live in just a moment. Welcome back to the program. And when we left you, we were talking about taxation and also about measures to help the B40 group and measures that should be in place. But hopefully, we're going to get more into this discussion right now. As it stands, prioritizing the well-being of the rakyat and providing opportunities to generate income is actually the fifth thrust of the budget. And some of the schemes that have been put in place to actually help the rakyat generate more income include an e-Rezeki and e-Usahawan, as well as an e-Ladang program, all online schemes. There's 100 million ringgit being allocated for this, and one would hope that this includes access to these online facilities and broadband to enable these communities to get online, because if they don't, they will not be able to take advantage of these schemes. There will also be easy loans for food trucks. The One Malaysia food truck scheme through Bank Rakyat with an interest rate of only 2%, 120 million ringgit is allocated for the scheme. One Azam program will also be in place to help increase revenue. 60 million ringgit is focused on this scheme. So we cannot really argue that there's nothing in the budget for the B40 community in helping to alleviate their gross income. With me in the studio once again to help dissect the budget, and now we're going to go right into focusing on income for the lower earners, is of course Dr. Muhammad Abdul Kadir and KHALID, and also we have THERESA Go. I'm trying to really say your names really quick so we can get right into the discussion. The budget does offer many avenues for the rakyat to earn and generate income. And some of the proponents of the budget would argue that the rakyat need to take the step towards actually registering for these programs. Do they do that?
I have no idea. But if you look at BRIM, for instance, those who you look at those who get it is usually batch those B40.
So one would also suppose that this community, the group that receives BRIM, would automatically be registered for some of these programs, which would help them earn more income.
You know, you have to remember also, a bulk chunk, the biggest chunk of those in B40 are the elderly. Training, more education would not do much, right? What you need is, for this group, for instance, a better social protection, social safety net. For instance, instead of we giving BRIM 3 times a year, 1,002, for old people you give everything. Better, and you give to pregnant women, 1,000 days program. That's the most important period of a human being. More to protect those vulnerable, for instance. Training for those youth, income about 2,000, which currently gets BRIM. Maybe you say, okay, I'm not going to give it to you. Maybe for training, I'll give it to you. Or conditional on training, right? BRIM, in a way, it is a good program. It does help. 1,200 is a lot to a lot of people. Maybe in Bangsa, it's not nothing. For a lot of people, it helps. But how do you optimize this? And to which group? And it depends on your objective, right? If it's a social protection, then it should be more inclusive.
We're also looking at the provision of 50 Kedai Rakyat Satu Malaysia, or KRIM, by selling 5 basic necessities at lower prices, namely rice, sugar, oil, flour, and cooking gas, as well as another 50 SKUs. So there's a basket of goods and services which would be sold at lower prices, only through Kedai Rakyat Satu Malaysia. The widening of the scope of Kedai Rakyat Satu Malaysia, as well as more Kedai Rakyat Satu Malaysia set up throughout the nation, do you think that's going to help these lower income groups benefit from the lower prices?
You look at the experience of Kedai Rakyat Satu Malaysia. We don't have quite a good picture, good success story of Kedai Rakyat Satu Malaysia. That's number one. Number two, I'm not a proponent separating society. You buy few items. If you're low income, you go buy at that shop. We already separate enough. Even to buy, purchase stuff, we separate again. What you should do instead, make sure the prices come down.
Across the board?
Across the board. Everyone benefits.
THERESA, let's analyze GST. It's a big part of the budget. 42 billion in terms of revenue has been collected from GST, which offsets the loss of 1 billion due to revision of tax for personal income tax. So what does GST really do for the lower income groups? Does it really hurt them where it hurts the most? Do they spend more on consumption than any other group?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, GST is actually a consumption tax, right? So there are basic necessities that are already zero rated, but I suppose it depends on where they eat and where they frequent, right? So if they go to places where the shops are not GST registrants, then it's still without GST, right? So the impact may not be that great, right? So I suppose if you look at GST, I mean, there is no choice, yeah? This is a fiscal reform initiative that we have embarked on, and if we had not, it would have been, you know, that was really our savior for the past few years, right? So, and that's something that we need to continue to do. Then it's a question of then how you manage it, right? So, so for the lower income, then how do you manage it? So are there further goods to be zero rated? I don't know. Has there been any studies and all that actually been done? Because when you talk about the higher cost of living, everybody's blaming it on GST, right? It's very easy to just blame it on GST. But really, where the B40 is concerned, how much of the purchases are impacted by GST? Maybe not that much, because basic essentials are already zero rated. Then it's a question of the people who are selling those goods. Are you increasing prices? There's no GST, but you increase the price of the goods. Then what causes the price increase? Of course, you've got customs, you've got anti-profiteering and all that, right? To make sure that people don't take advantage of that just to increase prices, right?
But let's look at the man who actually sells to the man who finally sells. The person in between, the transporter of these goods and services, they do incur GST for their cost of transportation. So it's almost impossible for these zero-rated items to completely escape GST.
True.
Of course.
Would you agree with that?
I agree. When we talk about GST, maybe some misconception we have to clear first. One is this. One, we always hear, GST is still low. Singapore is 7%.
Yes, right.
Singapore started almost 1st April Fool's Day, same like us, April Fool's Day. 1993, 3% no exemption, 3%. It took them 13 years to reach 7%. We straight away went to 6%. That's number one. Number two, since 2015, we collected about 110 billion in GST, total, including this year. I don't think people would complain if they know the money is well spent and they don't see the money, there's leakages, improper use of tax collection. You take example of Nordic countries. Tax rate is much higher than Malaysia, much higher than Singapore. Tax avoidance is very low because you pay, you know they're not going to do funny stuff with the money. Train is on time, education is free, I'm sick, they take care of me. The trust in government is an important characteristic.
Well, that is true. There are, of course, Auditor General reports that give us sleepless nights when we read through some of the pages. But when we look at this budget in particular, it does provide for a lot of those concerns as well. Let's look at some of the schemes provided for retirees. You speak about planning for the future, and there's an increase of contribution to the One Malaysia Retirement Scheme, or SP1M, to a 15% maximum of 250 annually for 5 years, from 2018 to 2022. Does this help Malaysians in the lower income or even the middle income group plan for their future retirement? Because, of course, the EPF savings and etc. may not be sufficient come D-Day when they finally say, goodbye to the workforce. Theresa, do you think this is a good thing in place for One Malaysia Retirement Scheme?
It is a good thing. Even for those contributing to EPF, I think EPF's report recently said, right? I mean, it's kind of shocking as to how much people really have left when they retire, because they would have withdrawn for housing, for medical, for children's education, etc. There's really not much left, right? So it is. So, again, I think, what can you do to really, increase the income of the people? If you talk about working for 10 years and only getting 10,000 a month, and then is there an opportunity for many of them to actually even get there when they retire, right? Retire at $10,000 a month. That seems to be, if you look at our statistics, I think that's not very common either. So there's not much left for them. So what can we do? I mean, how can we help in that sense, right?
Perhaps also if we look at the Asian mindset, even the Malaysian mindset, on owning houses, house ownership. It's been a big thing in many budgets, how to get more people to own houses. We see this budget sort of giving an alternative in rental. If you can't really own a house, well, renting is not such a bad idea. That's also an idea that's mooted in other developed nations, in European countries, for example, and people are happy to just go about their lives living in a property they rent for the rest of their lives. Doctor, your comment?
We discussed this before the show. What we did different this year, not we, the government did different, I'm not in the government, did different this year, 50% reduction from your rental income. Who benefit? Is it those who rent? Because we assume the owner of the house will reduce the rental. Highly unlikely. It's cumbersome. I maintain the rate to save what 200, we calculate about 200, 300. The intervention of government in the 11 position was correct. Private sector are not building enough affordable housing. We're going to do it. The government going to do it. We establish Prima. We have a target of 1 million. But the houses in Malaysia is not affordable. First quarter of this year, for every 100 houses that we built, only a quarter affordable. 1 in 4 affordable. Last year, the ratio is much higher. Income is low. It's not by giving easy financing you buy a house. No, it's because of income.
I would argue also that there are too many agencies tasked with this.
Exactly. It should be only one.
There should be only one. I mean, we can see the experience of SPAD, the commission tasked with actually putting together land public transport. It was in disarray and many agencies involved. But when you consolidate everything into one agency, we can see things are running smoother now. That should be the same with housing.
Can I just, one more thing, what you said earlier, the Asian mindset to own a house.
Yes.
It makes perfect sense. In other countries, in Nordic countries, I retire, I have nothing, it's okay. Something I'll get from the government. My pension, well, I don't have to worry. I don't have to worry about my children. Education in Canada, education is free. In France, minimal. Here, what you have, the only thing that you're going to have as a safety net is your house.
Your house. THERESA, we spoke about this, consolidating many agencies into one. Is that something that probably this budget missed? Will it be something that will be introduced in future budgets?
Yeah, we hope so, because like we said, the numbers that were announced in the previous years, right? But the actual number that has really been built is a small fraction of the total number that was budgeted for, even over the past few years. And this year, there's further announcement for more units, to be built. But then, if you don't have that agency to manage all this, at the end of the year, then we can see how many units actually have been built, and and people are being able to buy it. But like you said, it's not just helping them with the financing and the legal fees and all that, but the monthly repayments, right? So if they can't afford that, then that's not going to work for them as well. So perhaps the other scheme that they talked about in previous budgets as well, where you rent to own, right? And then, so that would probably be better, right, for them.
I want to take one last dive into GST and figure out where we can actually improve the system. There have been talks about taxation for digital transactions, and that's going to add cost to every purchase you make on Zalora.com, maybe. No plug intended. So when we look at GST, if it's going too far into the nitty-gritty of just about every aspect of life, would it be a little bit too much?
Yeah, we were having this debate, right? And many people were expecting GST to be imposed on this as well. Then it's a question of, at the end of the day, it's a consumption tax, right? So it's not those foreign businesses that are going to be charged the GST. It's the local consumers. Then you talk about, okay, B40, would there be any who would be using any of these, downloading songs and movies?
Absolutely,
and all that?
right?
There could be, I don't know. Maybe it's cheaper, right, than watching a movie in a theater, right? And
legal
M40
downloads.
and all that.
Legal
as well.
downloads.
Probably.
We're talking about legal downloads here, people.
So like M40 would definitely be impacted by that as well. And on the income tax side as well, right? There's no permanent establishment. You can't insist that you want to take a withholding tax. So we were talking about B2B businesses. That means if you place an advertisement on Facebook, for example, on Google, a business places advertisement, and then you make a payment, and there is a withholding tax. So you can't take the withholding tax unless there is, it is not prescribed, right? So that's not in the services. So what India did was they came up with something that's outside of tax, right? Otherwise, you'll be challenged. It's not in the treaty, you can't withhold, and things like that. So they called it an Equalization Levy. But then again, the cost goes back to the business. So if the business places an ad, the business will have to pay that additional, that's for 6%. So they have to pay equalization levy of 6% to the government, right? But it's the business, right? It's still not the foreigner. So it's difficult to get the foreigners to pay the tax.
That's an interesting way of going about it. But India does have this very complicated GST system, which will require some analysis to understand. There's a different rate of GST on gold. There's a different rate of GST on many other goods. And it ranges from 6 to 20%.
Yes, so many different rates.
So many different rates. So it can be a little bit confusing, and we don't want a system like that to come into play. Now, some of the grouses about GST is quite simple. But hang on, before we get into that, I believe we have a caller. Did we open the lines? Let's see who we have on the line. Good evening. Welcome to the program.
Yeah.
Hello?
Yeah.
Sharifa, you are on the air.
Yes. All right. Hello.
Hi, Sharifa. What do you have to say about Budget 2018?
Okay. Now, firstly, I'd like to congratulate for a very high-quality discussion.
Thank you.
On budget. I've been watching a lot of commentaries about budget, but I think tonight is the best. Okay. I have two questions actually. The first question, I'm not sure. I think before the break.
Right.
One of the panelists, was talking about digital revolution, if I'm not mistaken, right?
That would be me, but I'm not the panelist. But anyway, carry on.
Hello?
Carry on, Sharifa.
Yeah, all right. Talking about digital revolution. And I think in the budget, there was some amount of money allocated for encouraging companies or encouraging new industries to engage in this new economy.
Right, absolutely.
But I think the amount of money dedicated for that purpose is very low, 250 million. Is that correct? I think that's really it's just really nothing. I like to get the panelists' opinion. What if instead of providing, I mean, of course, it's good to have a dedicated funding to encourage new industries to engage in the new economy, but at the same time, perhaps a more sustainable strategy is to introduce tax exemption for certain amount of revenue spent towards reskilling and retraining workers. Because I think the industries in our country, they don't really spend much money on retraining because they feel that retraining is a burden, it's an extra cost for them. So why don't the government give some tax break there? So that's the first point that I like to get feedback from.
Right, thank you, Sharifa. Because your question was quite long, we have to cut you short there on your second question and then open the line to someone else. Is there someone else on the line? Good evening. All right, we've lost our second caller. But anyway, if you're going to call in, try to keep the question as short as possible. And I do believe there is a tax break for retraining. There is a HRDF fund which is set up as well where companies have to contribute. Your opinion on that, Theresa?
Yes, but I think we talked about that a little bit earlier, and we said that there's a matching grant and then there is accelerated capital allowances, but that's more for plant machinery, but not so much of the human factor of it, right? So like what Sharifa said, I think probably that makes sense, and that's what we talk about, that the IRB, not so much of an exemption, but a deduction. So whether it's a 2-time deduction or 4-time deduction, so for every 100 ringgit that you spend on retraining, probably you get 200 tax deduction or 400 even, if you want to do that, right? So that's an important area for the government to consider as well.
Right. Your opinion on retraining, Doctor, if we look at the graduates that are being churned out from universities, are they ready for this sort of industry, which is a different ball game altogether? It's an all-encompassing space where what they're trained to do has to be mashed up with what their colleagues are trained to do. So it's possibly retraining in another discipline altogether.
Of course, we hear this often, the mismatch within what the industry need, what we produce. But we forget one thing also, the incentive structure towards digital economy, automation, is not comprehensive. Why do I say that? At the same time, you give tax allowance, tax credit for this. On another hand, what we do, we still make it cheap to focus on labor-intensive manufacturing, for instance. Capital is cheap in Malaysia. Labor is super cheap. Illegal workers, in particular, you can treat them like slave, usually. Why should I automate? That's why you see the share of skilled workers in Malaysia as a percentage actually been coming down. You want to address this, you cannot forget about the foreign workers.
Well, we have another caller on the line. It's Priya. Hi. Good evening, Priya. Welcome to the show. Hello.
Hello. Good
Hi,
evening.
Priya. Good evening. Welcome.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
what's your
thank
question?
you. I'm going to keep it short.
Right.
But
Thank you.
I'd like to echo what THERESA said just now. We've had many reviews on the budget.
Okay.
But by far, I think Dr. Mohammed has been so unfiltered in his comments. So thank you.
And
Thank you
we
for that
unfilter
wisdom
him.
and that courage.
So I think the credit
And,
should also go to
I
us.
just have a very simple question, and I'm going to keep it short.
Please do.
This is a budget that has an income of 239.86 billion.
Right.
And the provision is 280.25 billion. It's
Right.
a deficit.
Right. It still is.
And I'd just like to get Dr. Mohammed's comments on it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. On the deficit, Doctor, this is the question you've probably been waiting for and the one I've been dreading to ask you. Here we go. Here's your chance to unload on this.
Priya is correct. We're going to collect 240 next year. We're going to spend 280. How do we spend? We spend two ways. Our tradition. We're going to spend on OPEX, basically your fixed costs, to pay salary, to pay retirees, to pay debt.
Right.
These three already take 60%. Balance, from 100 that you collect, you're going to spend almost 98 ringgit to pay this. Balance, how to build schools, roads, blah, blah, blah. You have to borrow. And you have to borrow about 40 billion. Not the sad part, the ironic is this. In the past 10 years, what we spend on development expenditure, build schools, blah, 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 has not increased in nominal terms. It's 40 billion, 40 billion. Our operational has been going up. That's number one. Number two, how do we finance this? Because we hutang, we debt. And there's an impact to this. We expect to pay interest on our loans about 24 or 28 billion. Couldn't remember exact amount. But when you look in comparison, this is more that we spend on development expenditure on transport, education, health, and security. To pay debt alone is more than what we spend development expenditure on this item. This is for future growth of the country. This is our investment. But we spend more actually on debt.
Maintaining the current infrastructure, basically.
No, to pay debt is more than this, which is not
maintain the current
healthy. In fact, the debt payment, I end with this. In fact, the debt payment ratio of OPEX, we have a limit. Not only debt limit of GDP to 55%. We cannot pay interest more than 15% of our OPEX. Now it's about 13% plus. We're not far off.
From that threshold.
Yeah.
However, our international reserves measure at 428.7 billion. How does this factor into cushioning any sort of blows that we may sustain? Or does it factor in at all?
On reserve?
Yeah, our reserves. Does it help with financing any sort of these plans and programs? Because always you hear mention of how these foreign reserves can finance X amount of budgets.
Yeah, you can.
So does it help?
You can increase your revenue. You ask GLC, Khazanah, to pay you more dividend. In fact, next year we expect higher revenue
from oil
collection.
And
exactly.
Yes. So these are the measures that are in place to actually help collect more revenue. So hopefully we'll see all these transpire in 2018, because we don't know what the oil price is going to be like come 1st of January 2018, whether or not it's going to be on the uptrend or whether it's going to reverse downwards, and only time will tell. Let us look back at some of the points that we've discussed and bring the show to a conclusion. We have 7 minutes left in the program. I do want to talk about how we are also looking at strengthening the capital market. This is interesting because every year we strive to do this, especially in the Islamic financing space. But this year we have a regulatory sandbox set up. And I don't think many people understand what a regulatory sandbox is all about. What really is something that will go into a sandbox of regulations? THERESA.
Well, I'm not too clear on that, but if you talk about sandbox, then you're talking about playing and experimenting and coming up with new ideas, etc. But then it's the word regulatory is there in that sense.
That's the thing that gets me.
Yeah.
Doctor, your opinion on this?
Same.
Same.
Yeah.
So it was
idea,
proposed in the financial space, strengthening the financial markets. And I do believe it's about playing with a bunch of regulations focused on small troubleshooting before actually taking this regulation into the public sphere. But let's also look at how we are focusing on strengthening the capital market. Intellectual property as an instrument of financial guarantee for business financing, 1.5 billion on this. Stamp duty exemptions for contract notes of exchange-traded funds and structured warrants for 3 years. Relief on tax imposed on venture capital and companies equivalent to the amount of investment. All this is great for new business. All this is great for starting up a new business. Do you think this will help strengthen our capital markets? And what's the threshold? Where do we need to be at to be a developed nation? Doctor, your economic point of view.
No idea, actually.
You're very honest.
Yeah. When we don't know, you say you don't know.
Yeah, I think we should focus on, well, we're talking about the budget and you're talking about, so much more revenue that we need to collect next year,
Where's it going to come from?
Yeah, where's it going to come from? 80% is coming from direct taxes, right? And if you talk about the additional taxes that are going to be collected, etc., well, it's a 6.3% increase even in for the tax revenue, right? So that's going to be difficult. So this is where when we talk about BEPS, base erosion, profit shifting, etc., right? And every country, not just Malaysia, right, is worried about erosion of the tax base and therefore reduction of the tax revenue, right? So what are we going to do? Are we prepared? I mean, some countries have given amnesties, voluntary disclosures, etc., right? Reduction in penalties, waiver of penalties, suspension of jail terms and all that for people to bring the money back and to voluntarily disclose and pay more. So there's this thing called AEOI, Automatic Exchange of Information. So with this exchange, or people who've been hiding their money in Swiss bank accounts, where previously the RRB would not be able to get the information. Now this information will automatically be sent back. Then it's a question of, big data coming in. How effectively can we look at this data and then go after the people who've earned Malaysian revenue but not paid tax here, but instead taken them all abroad, right? So now all this is going to come to light. So this is one way, maybe an amnesty program or something, and you voluntarily come forward and pay the taxes or something.
We're
maybe that's something that could be done too.
0.1% again, because I don't know many Malaysians that have Swiss bank accounts. Personally, no, I don't know them. I know they exist, but I don't know who they are.
That's the 1%. But we should focus also on the shadow economy, right? Make it easy for them to pay tax. Maybe set up counters in malls, supermarkets, and things like that, right? To make it easy for them to pay tax. And instead of having to keep accounts, hire a bookkeeper and all that, it's too cumbersome for them to do that, right? So maybe just a simplified tax system. Yeah, in the sense that, well, you're a hawker, right? So for hawkers, maybe your gross margin is net margin is 10%. 10% of last year's sales, and this is pay the tax.
But I was just about to say that the shadow economy does not just mean rich businesses that avoid tax, but also the char kway teow seller who feels it's cumbersome to calculate tax.
It's not that
he's got to focus on his product, on making the best possible char kway teow he can, instead of calculating his tax. So that takes a lot of time away from him. So make it easy for him to come forward and pay his tax. We have got a couple of minutes left. Doctor, your summary on the budget. I know I said we didn't want to paint too many broad strokes, but let's give a quick summary on what you think.
Quick one. When you look at the budget, how do you give a grade? Usually based on three things. One, on the finance side. We discussed. One, is it aligned with your mid-term to long-term plan, 11 Malaysian plan? Some of what been said in the budget is good, I have to admit, but we want perfection as a country. On 11 Malaysian plan, I would say it's 50-50. In terms of inequality, it has not done so well. In terms of cost of living, the current issues, long-term plan, also current issues. Some we address mostly on income supplement, but the source of rising prices, we are not addressing well.
Theresa, your quick summary on the budget.
Well, I think there's something there for everyone. I'm just more concerned about taxes again, and that if the inland revenue and customs are under so much pressure to collect more because they've got a higher budget now, in the enforcement, etc., hopefully, well, they'll be nice to taxpayers, right? Penalties have increased from 45 to 100%, and then, and we see them being very aggressive and so on. So that's why we hope that they will not be too aggressive.
We can hope that they will be nice. And that is our final word on the budget 2018. We look forward to more programs like this on RTM, so please do stay tuned as we pick apart the budget throughout the week, of course, on Landscape and other programs. Thank you so much for staying tuned and joining me in this discussion. Thank you for calling in. I'm Terence Das. Good night, everybody, and have a great week ahead.